Hello, political scientists. Welcome back once again to the white void of my recording studio. It's just a corner of the room, but it doesn't matter. I've left a thing on Show My Homework talking about maybe doing a live Teams meeting tomorrow because it's feedback for your essays, and I honestly don't know how better to discuss with you your essay and also hear any queries that you might have about my handwriting or my spelling, from among other things, and also give general feedback. So let me know about that and whether or not you want to do that. That's for tomorrow. And it'll be for the equivalent of period 1, so it'll be 9:25 in the morning. The meeting will be recorded, so you can access that after the fact. However, that's not the purpose of today's lesson. It will be a double lesson today. There'll be 2 lessons. I put them together because it's just easier to do that way. My apologies for taking so long to publish it, but this is the input, if you will, on the functions of Parliament. We've talked about its composition. We've talked about that and the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Today, we're probably going to get through just the House of Commons. I want to talk about functions that they provide, but we'll see how it goes. So, standard procedure where I do really bad etiquette. So, functions of Parliament. There it is again. Parliament in the background. No awful joke this time. You'll be glad to know. So, to start with, what do I mean when I talk about functions? You probably remember, but it's after Christmas. It's been a while. A reminder, functions are what a body in our polity is an area where politics takes place, actually does. And the other thing we've got to consider when we look at the functions of any given body within our political establishment is how well that body does the functions that it's supposed to do, the effectiveness, if you will. Now, both the House of Commons and the House of Lords provide different functions in our political system. But they do have some crossover. You'll see in a moment. The House of Commons, for example, legitimizes the monarch's decisions. That's why it was set up in the first place. The whole point was to widen the appeal and to widen the input for what monarchs, in particular kings, were trying to achieve. Over time, the monarch's views on the matters have become less and less important, culminating in 1628 with the Bill of Rights, where the monarch was relatively unimportant indeed. And from that point onwards, Parliament really became the mover and shaker. And the reason it was able to do that was because of its legitimacy, because it was wider in terms of consent from the people who were being ruled. Nowadays, its other major function is to enact legislation. Now, it can do both things. It can formulate legislation and make the law, but it also supervises turning that law into something. It has an executive and a legislative function. It can scrutinise government. In fact, that's one of its major jobs. This is mainly carried out, believe it or not, and quite surprisingly, through committees rather than through major debates. That having been said, debates play their role, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But mainly, Parliament is there to scrutinise government through various committees, and we'll talk about the committees later on in this lesson. Fourthly even, I can count, it functions to represent constituencies to central government. It tries to take the localities and bring them into the central decision-making in Westminster, and it allows people to represent the views of their constituents to the government and the executive of the day. So MPs are expected to act on local considerations. We talked about this when we're talking about political parties and we're talking about the role of democracy. Fifthly, there is debate. I mentioned we talk about it. Debate is there to raise issues in the public consciousness and also to give people a feeling that things have been talked through effectively before they are put into law. And finally, Parliament provides government. It provides the members of government. It provides the government itself. The government is part of Parliament. And so Parliament's function is to provide that government, to provide that, if you will, leadership. The House of Lords overlaps with a lot of these things. For one, it overlaps with the idea of enacting legislation. It's one of the things that it does. It provides further debate and scrutiny of that legislation. It's part of the process. On that point, it also scrutinises government and policy through committees. It has its very own committees set up for that purpose. In terms of legitimacy, representation, government, and debate, and those areas of Parliament's functions, the House of Lords plays less of a role. with it being an appointed chamber rather than an elected chamber, it doesn't really have that much in the way of legitimacy and consent from the people. In terms of representation, because it's an appointed chamber, it's really difficult to ascertain exactly who they represent, and so therefore it doesn't really aid in representation. In terms of providing government, it's not expected by convention to actually provide a government. Rather, its role is to provide debate. And in that regard, it can raise issues. Bear in mind, it's an expertise chamber. It's a chamber of people who are there because, in many cases, they are experts in their field or they're recognized characters in their field. And as a consequence, when they have debates, those debates carry some weight. So whilst they don't change things directly, they can bring things to attention and force the House of Commons to discuss things. Well, I say force it in terms of bringing things to prominence that might not otherwise be there. So let's talk about the House of Commons. That's the House of Commons in the background there, and you'll note that that is very deliberately a photograph that I took before. I didn't take the photograph, sorry, I took from the internet, and that is before coronavirus. You can tell because it's not got all the yellow tape down, but it's that view I showed you in the last slide. And I quite like it. It gets a feel for just how big that chamber actually is, and you don't get a feel for that sometimes on the TV. So the legitimation, which is a word I think the textbook made up, it's providing legitimacy. And it does this by providing consent, initially for the Crown and then later for itself. And it does this through elections. We vote in our members of Parliament to represent us in Parliament. They are not delegates, they are representatives. And in so doing, in taking part, we all accept that the government can do what it does because the people have agreed with it through a general election. That is what we call consent. No one's going to go out there and wave and whoop and cheer about how wonderful a job the government is doing. It's certainly not the current government. But equally, we all accept that it is their job. Equally, we're not going to go down and firebomb the Houses of Parliament. I'd recommend against it. And for that reason, Parliament has legitimacy. Whatever the government does, whatever they try to pass into law, whatever they try and create a bill on, they require the support of Parliament. Parliament must approve those bills before they can become law. This, in essence, is parliamentary sovereignty. This is where it comes from. This is what it means. And it means that Parliament itself can give the consent of the people to the laws that it passes. And they do that by voting on things. Since 1911, another job that Parliament does through the House of Commons, the House of Commons has the exclusive right to approve budgets. Budgets in this case gets a capital B because it's a thing, a proper title. And the budget is what the government is going to spend and how they're going to use the tax revenue that they've raised to do the jobs that they are supposed to do. And that approval of a budget can only come from the House of Commons. Since 1911, the House of Lords has literally no say in it anymore. And you'll remember that 1911 is the Parliament Act, and it was there because of the People's Budget in 1909 that the House of Lords was trying not to approve. So you know that this was going to be a thing. So the House of Commons exclusively has that role, that function, and they provide legitimacy to that budget because they are the representatives of the people. And as a consequence, we give our consent to be taxed and to have the spending agreed through the budget. Since 2003, Parliament has also asserted the right to be consulted on the use of military force. The government cannot do it without parliamentary approval. Now, I should point out that this is mainly a convention, not a rule or a form of constitution. And you'll remember there are very different things. So since 2003, it was the Iraq War, and Tony Blair, for he was behind it, was trying to get approval to go to war in Iraq, to change the regime there rather than to deal with anything like the invasion of Kuwait with the first Gulf War in 1991. So the consultation on military force, he decided, was a good way of getting that consent from the people and thereby ignoring the Stop War Coalition. And it kind of worked. Since then, Parliament has asserted its right to approve of military action rather than allowing it to be a government prerogative, something the government can do without referring to Parliament, which previous to 2003 was largely the case. So does it work? Well, it rather depends on what you think. Now, I've attached this PowerPoint to the lesson, and you got this video link from. So you can access all of these things that are currently on the screen. Each of those images and one video clip refer to whether or not Parliament provides its function. So in 2013, David Cameron argued for action in Syria. And it went to vote in Parliament. There's the image it's this one here, of him attempting to get people to vote with him, and he lost. It was the first time a government had lost a vote on military action. But given that it's only been 10 years at that point, it's maybe not a huge deal. In 2018, Theresa Human Rights Are Optional May launched military action in Syria in line with the US from a podium in number 10 Downing Street. There it is. You might recognize that room now. It's been used rather a lot with coronavirus briefings, but at the time that was relatively new. There was an emergency meeting called the following day where Parliament asserted its right to discuss it, but she carried on regardless. There was no vote. And that's interesting. That's only, 15 years after this convention was set in motion. Again, in 2019, Theresa Human Rights Are Optional May attempted to pass the EU Withdrawal Bill using Henry VIII powers, i.e. without parliamentary debate. I'll come on to the Henry VIII clauses in a moment, don't worry. She was taken to court by Gina Miller in 2017. That's why I've got these tabloids here that are bemoaning the fact that someone gets to say that Parliament should have a role in our own sovereignty. Anyway, in 2017, she lost the court case. Parliament was given a constitutional role because it was not just altering the EU, the EC Communities Act from 1976. Was it 76? I think it was earlier than that. It might have been 72, my apologies. Johnson in 2019 attempted to prorogue Parliament, and the video link that I have here, if you click on it, you'll notice that it goes to 3:10. That starts the video part way through, so you don't just look for it. That will take you through the actual prorogation of Parliament. It took place before the Supreme Court struck it down on the grounds that the information that had been provided to the Queen was incorrect, and therefore the prorogation shouldn't go ahead. Parliament had strenuously objected to the government getting Parliament prorogued. What does prorogued mean? It means shut under the rules of the Queen. The Queen says, I don't want a Parliament anymore, and then it goes into recess. It's as simple as that. And the government argued they didn't need a parliamentary vote on that. They could just push it through. The Supreme Court disagreed. Parliament voted against it, and thus Parliament, in a puff of logic, came back into being. It was an interesting time, and that particular video is fascinating because you get to see the pomp and circumstance and the ceremony. Now, the video is quite long. I would watch it on 1.5 times speed for the most part, just to get a feel for what's going on, rather than watch it closely. But if you do want to watch it closely, I think it's approximately an hour. It's from the Graniad, and for that I apologise. That's the Guardian, it's just the way I refer to the newspaper. And yeah, do have a watch before continuing. So pause the video here, go and have a watch of that for a bit. I'm going to assume that that's enough time for people to have paused and gone to watch it. I hope you found it interesting. I think part of it that got me was the attempt to sit on the speaker to prevent him leaving the chair. You're not allowed to lay hands on the speaker, but no one said anything about butt cheeks. And also, I think there was the singing at the end. It's fascinating. So the prorogation, that isn't, the video clip isn't about the failure of that prorogation. It shows the effectiveness of Parliament. Parliament was able to get itself back into session. In coronavirus for 2022, I have been unable to find any images or transcripts in Hansard of any debate about the lockdown on the 24th of March. All I could find from the was this still here from when the measures were announced by the government. That's literally all I can find. And as you can see, people are already socially distancing except on the government front bench. So I don't know. There was no vote on the matter, but everyone appears to have agreed with it. So does that mean it's a success of Parliament? Parliament wanted a lockdown, the government was forced into it. Or does it mean it's not a success of Parliament? There was no vote on it, the government announced it, and it happened without parliamentary assent. I think it can be used both ways, depending on how you want to argue in an essay. In fact, within an essay, I'd recommend arguing both ways and coming down on one side or the other. Ultimately, I mean, more or less. Henry VIII clauses are the name given to the government power to change details of existing legislation that's already been passed by Parliament. Parliament have agreed in principle to the law or the idea, and the government monkeys around with the details because they've changed. So, for example, a law on speeding only applied to cars, and then it's been adapted to apply to bikes and tractors. It's not a thing, I'm just using it as a for instance. That would be a use of Henry VIII powers. Angela Eagle in 2019, my mistake, argued that the government was overusing Henry VIII's powers and they were being abused slightly. And certainly during 2019, under Theresa May's administration, and latterly under Boris Johnson's administration, the government has sought to use them rather than hold new debates when altering or changing existing legislation, or trying to pass laws by changing existing legislation, if that makes sense, to avoid what we call parliamentary scrutiny. So you could argue that whenever there's a successful use of the Henry VIII powers, that is a lack of success, sorry, scratching my eye, for the functions of Parliament, for Parliament providing legitimation to things. We'll get rid of those. Legislation, the major job of a Parliament. Passing laws. How do we pass laws? Now, luckily, we don't have to go into too much depth on this one. It goes like this. Public bills are those that are passed by the government. The government suggests them based on points in their manifesto. They go through 2 readings in Parliament. Each reading is followed by a vote about proceeding to the next stage. Usually this is formality. It's whoever's in the chamber, i.e. whoever can be bothered talking about it. And then it's passed to the public bill committees. More about them in a moment. Public bill committees discuss it, they change it where necessary, they amend it where necessary, and then they go to the report stage. They report back to Parliament, there's another vote about whether or not to pass it to the House of Lords. Once it gets passed to the House of Lords, they also have a reading, they also have a debate, they also have a chance to amend the document, and then they then pass it back to the House of Commons, who will vote on it a final time. Then if it passes those votes, it goes to the Queen and gains royal assent when it becomes a law. That's how bills work. Now, the amendment process is fascinating because you can choose to simply reject amendments, vote on amendments, or not vote on amendments. And I'll talk about that more later. Generally speaking, a government majority means that when they're trying to pass a law that's in their manifesto, they can rely on a majority, meaning that the process of passing a public bill is a formality. Most of the time, governments suggest bills and they are passed. They progress through the stages slowly. Opposition politicians or people within the party who want to rebel will try and slow it down if they want to make a particular point or amendment, but generally speaking, it can be relied upon that governments get what they want. 2019 is a fascinating example because it was a year in which Theresa May's government simply failed to do that. Their majority wasn't enough. They had to rely on the DUP. And that is a fascinating case study. Some examples exist in the textbook, but the textbook was only published, I think, in February or March 2019. And as a consequence, a lot of what happened in 2019, especially during the summer, isn't in there. So keep that in mind. There's an awful lot of examples that do not appear in the textbook that are easily findable on the internet. Public bill committees also have a government majority. You'll notice I've shortened committee to CMTs, and you'll see why when I spell out committee. You can do that in an exam, by the way. There's nothing to stop you. CMT is a committee, and you don't have to capitalize it. It's fine. Just capitalize the first letter. Public bill committees are appointed by party whips. And if you remember, party whips are people whose job it is to make sure people vote a particular way through cajoling, threatening, convincing, holding blackmail. So they get to decide who's on the committee, and they get to decide who the chair of the committee is. Therefore, it's in your best interests to do as you're told and do as the government wants. So these public bill committees tend to be a rubber stamping committee. They tend to do as they are asked by the government, when they're asked by the government, in the timetable they're asked by the government. And if you're an opposition MP appointed by your party leader, you will also act on your party whip. You will vote on partisan lines. This leads to criticism of how legislation is passed. because sometimes you end up with rather poor legislation that is a knee-jerk reaction to a popular issue. The textbook has the example, and it's a good one, of the Dangerous Dogs Act of 1991. Following a spate of attacks on children by dogs that killed the children, the government passed legislation to try and limit the use of the breeds that had been the killers of these children. The RSPCA objected on the grounds that it made it sound like all other breeds of dog were perfectly safe. And furthermore, the breed of the dog might not actually be the problem. It was just that certain training and certain people holding certain breeds of dogs might actually be the issue. Nevertheless, the legislation was passed, it's still law, and it's largely unenforceable. What it means is that people who own a pit bull, for example, are breaking the law. It's as simple as that. Various breeds of dog are illegal in the UK, which is rubbish because it drove the breeding of these breeds underground, the sale of these breeds underground. It didn't stop people having the dogs. It arguably made them more dangerous because now it's a point of pride or a point of snubbing the government to own these breeds of dog and to train them to be, well, attack dogs in many ways, or guard dogs. So you could argue that the knee-jerk reaction of the Dangerous Dogs Act led to more problems than it actually solved. This is also true of the Psychoactive Substances Act of 2016, and I've mentioned this one before. It's the one that says that anything apart from prescribed substances that changes your emotional state through ingestion is an illegal substance, which means that virtually everything is an illegal substance now. And well, it's not been that I've missed out, I know, in psychoactive substances. It just says psychoactive. I do apologise. It's not been tested in a court of law. And if it were, I imagine it would turn out to be unenforceable. It's fascinating. It's a knee-jerk reaction to legal highs and an attempt to try and stop people being one step ahead of the law when producing new versions of legal highs. They were legal because they hadn't yet been legislated against. That was the point. So, yeah, it was an effort to stop that. So it solved one problem, I suppose, legal highs, but created a number of other problems that have not yet been tested in law, and it might not actually do the job that it was set out to do. Ergo, poor legislation passed through due to a government majority and a 3-line whip. There are some notable defeats, and I have messed up chronically here. Never mind. There are some notable defeats that prove that sometimes legislation isn't just a foregone conclusion, and that sometimes Parliament can sort of flex, if you will, and stop things being passed. For example, there was the 90 days detention without trial. We talked about that. It was the Terrorism Act in 2006. 2005, I apologise. There were 49 rebels on that one, 49 Labour MPs who disagreed with the Labour government who voted against it, meaning that it was defeated 291 votes to 322, meaning that Tonty Blair faced a government defeat on a government bill. Again, the Shops Bill of 1986 was about Sunday opening hours. Margaret Thatcher wanted to increase Sunday opening hours to match those of other days. She faced 72 rebels within her own party, meaning that even though she had a majority of 140 seats, she lost the vote 282 to 296, meaning that it was not passed. It was a government defeat. It was tried again under David Cameron in 2016 with the reforms on Sunday trading laws. There are only 27 rebels to his proposal, but even that was enough to say that they lost a vote, 286 to 317. The Brexit Bill in 2017, there were 11 rebels to the government, and that was enough to defeat it, 309 to 305. The EU, I do apologise. The Brexit Bill meant that Parliament got control of having a final say on whether or not the EU Withdrawal Bill would be accepted. And it was won against government advice. My apologies. There were 11 rebels from Theresa May's government that meant that it passed by 309 to 305. My apologies. The EU Withdrawal Bill itself was defeated 3 times in 2019, one of which was the largest defeat ever. I've put that one in bold, 432 to 202. It is the largest margin of defeat the government has ever suffered in the history of ever, which is astonishing. It was followed by another vote in February. That was in January 2019. In February 2019, it was brought back and was defeated again, 391 votes to 242. And it was defeated for a final time in March, 344 votes to 286. The last time it was brought back, the government tried one more time, and John Bercow argued for Erskine May, saying the bill hadn't changed substantially, and therefore there was no point in having another vote. So there you go. That's how you can do that through legislation. There are examples there, notable defeats of the government, in which you can argue that perhaps it's not a foregone conclusion, and perhaps it's not all down to government majorities and a sort of rubber stamping process and an elected dictatorship. I'm going to take my face off the screen for this next bit so you can see the box. Let's talk about scrutinising the government. How do you do this? And I mentioned that it was mainly through committees. Let's start with public bill committees. Whips decide who sit on that public bill committee, meaning that the people on the public bill committee will tend to follow the party line. They'll do as they are told. This means you could argue that there's less debate and thus less scrutiny of government legislation, because the public bill committee is set up largely through convention on the size of various parties in Parliament itself, meaning the government has a baked-in majority, and because you've been appointed by whips, they're always going to win if the government wants to. However, there is an opportunity to take evidence from experts. They can call for written evidence from experts, they can call for witnesses themselves, and they can discuss things with interested parties or parties that may be affected by the law. And that means there is an opportunity to discuss the impact of the law. So although there might not be a large amount of debate, and although the chances of changing this are relatively small, at least there's been some attempt to assess the impact of a new law. It is possible that MPs can cooperate with one another, and that is a limited chance for the opposition to table amendments to laws before they go further and change them according to what they would like. Now, there are some examples of this taking place. The textbook doesn't list them, but you can talk about limited examples of it taking place throughout the years of Tony Blair, for example, and throughout the years of Margaret Thatcher even. So go and have a look. I'm sure you'll find laws yourself, and the examples you guys find will be far more effective than any I give you because, well, you found them and you'll remember them as a consequence. The next major committee, he says, there we go, thank you. The next major committee are select committees, and these have been around since 1979. I'll bring my Fizzock back. So they were first brought in 1979 under Margaret Thatcher. And the idea is that these select committees were to oversee the work of particular departments and particular policy areas. And they were to monitor departments of state or specific policy commitments to ensure they didn't overstep their bounds and to make sure they were doing their job appropriately. And so they're a form of checking the homework, if you will, of various government departments, and they can call in ministers for questioning about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what the reasoning is behind what they're doing. What evidence have they heard? They can also hear evidence themselves. So, for example, you have a select committee on defence, the Defence Select Committee, or you have a specific policy commitment, a select committee on HS2, where they check how's HS2 going, where's the money being spent, how are tenders being done, is it value for money, does it make sense? One of the most famous of these is the Public Affairs Committee. The Public Affairs Committee looks into whether or not it's cost effective for doing various things. And they will talk a lot about how much money's been spent and how much benefit has been created from a particular form of policy. Generally speaking, select committees have 11 members, meaning that when and if they hold a vote, there'll always be a majority. You can't therefore tie the vote. They're voted in by party. So they generally tend to reflect the makeup of the House of Commons. And you might argue, well, that gives the government a baked-in majority. Yes, but because every member of the party gets to vote who sits on that committee, backbenchers tend to get more of a role. So if there are enough people who disagree with the government, they can vote in a member of their group onto a committee, meaning that there's a more wide opinion in a select committee than there might be otherwise on something like a public bill committee. It also means it's not under the control of the party leadership. So the party leadership is left really with charm to get what they want. And that goes to the opposition parties as well. The chairs of these are elected by the whole of the Commons. So who's in charge of it? The person who sets the agenda and who assesses whether or not they're going to argue about things particularly, or how the debate goes, how much time is given, whether amendments are chosen or not. That's elected by the whole of the Commons. So it generally tends to mean that the chair of a committee is someone who is widely respected by all the parties in Parliament rather than just by the government or the executive. And this is an amazing thing for backbenchers who are respected but don't have positions of power. Some examples to prove the point, or rather, before I get to the examples, their salary is similar to a junior minister, and that's designed to increase their independence and also the number of MPs who want the job. This is well remunerated, and therefore people who get the job tend to be there and independently powerful. Some examples to prove the point are Sarah Wollaston, the MP, who is the Health and Social Care Select Committee Chair from 2015 onwards. She sat as an independent after having left the Conservative Party and still chairs the Health and Social Care Select Committee. She is widely respected by all sides of the House, and as a consequence, when she questions people, people tend to listen. Between 2015 and 2019, the 2019 December election, Frank Field MP, a Labour MP, was the Work and Pensions Select Committee. He regularly clashed with the Labour Party leadership and was one of 5 Labour MPs to support Brexit in 2016, meaning he's an independently minded MP and not beholden to his party political masters. As a consequence, he was widely respected by all sides of the House when it came to the Work and Pensions Select Committee and his ability to ask questions. Further note, he tends to be a neoliberal. I think he's very much more effusive of Starmer than he was of Corbyn. Make of that what you will. 2016 to 2020, Hilary Benn MP was the Brexit Select Committee chairman. And again, Hilary Benn was widely respected. He was related, of course, to Tony Benn, a widely respected politician who you may have heard about before. And Hilary Benn was a widely respected MP, still is, and widely seen as being forensic in his questioning. And as you well know, started the coup against Corbyn and therefore was absolutely not beholden to his party political masters and remained so until 2020, of course, when this department, this select committee was wound up because on the 31st of December, there was no more exiting the EU department to be monitored. So that stopped being a thing. These committees, these select committees, can send for persons, papers and records, i.e. they can subpoena things, if I use the American terminology that you might be used to from the TV. They can see pretty much anything they want. They can compel people to attend their meetings and they can compel people to answer. And because they're protected by parliamentary privilege, they can ask potentially libelous questions. They can ask questions you can't ask by law anywhere else in the country because they have to. So they can ask these questions without fear. However, this can lead to what some people refer to as a bear pit atmosphere. Let me give you an example. And the example here is the 15th of July, 2003, and a bloke called David Kelly. David Kelly was called before a select committee, and the Defence Select Committee asked him, the MP was a bloke called McKinlay, who he had spoken to in the press, which journalists. Now, generally speaking, journalists try to protect their sources. They don't tend to reveal who they've spoken to if they wish to remain anonymous, allowing people to say whatever they want, whenever they feel necessary, which is useful if you're trying to get whistleblowing out there, because it means people don't lose their jobs and they don't face prosecution. For David Kelly to admit which journalists he'd spoken to would be very, very clearly something that would damage his relationship with those journalists and his ability to speak out. He hesitated. And when he hesitated, McKinlay reminded him that he had an obligation to answer the question. The pressure was so much that basically, 2 days later, he committed suicide. And the coroner's report said it was because of the select committee, because David Kelly was under so much pressure and didn't know how best to respond. And that's that. These people effectively can kill and have done. Well, I suppose suicide, you kill yourself, but you see the point I'm trying to make. This is no minor thing. The next committee I'm going to talk about is a single committee. It's the liaison committee. The liaison committee represents all select committee chairs. So all the chair people join their own committee, known as the liaison committee. And their job is to regularly question the Prime Minister about his policy, about why he's carrying out his policy, and about how that policy works. Now, the idea is that they do this relatively regularly. By convention, that's about once every month or so. But that's a convention. There's no rule in place about that. It's just how it goes. And it allows them to ask about things that they find pressing. Now, interestingly, during coronavirus, one of the liaison committee, well, the only liaison committee meeting with the Prime Minister was televised. It was streamed live. And I watched it when it happened. And it was a fascinating thing to watch. It is supposed to be less confrontational. It's supposed to, than Prime Minister's questions. It's supposed to be somewhere where the Prime Minister can talk and talk more openly about what they're doing. Equally, it is expected that the Prime Minister will arrive briefed. They will be fully cognizant of all the different policies, and they will have had time to prepare for that meeting so that they can talk about the minutiae, they can talk about the detail, which you might not get in Prime Minister's question time. And if you've watched any PMQs, you know exactly what I mean. There are scoring of political points, there's things you're not prepared for, there's points that go back to weird stats. Liaison committees tend to be less adversarial and therefore tend to be better prepared for. Now, the example I've got for you, here is the link. You'll see that it starts at 2-8 seconds in. Again, it's the drawing out, and I do apologise. This is not any of that, and it is fascinating to listen to because it gives an insight into what is expected and what actually transpires on the day. And the current government tend not to listen to convention, and I found that of interest, and I thought you might find it of interest too. Were we in a lesson, I would force you to watch it, and we'd probably watch it for a good deal of time just to get a feel for what's going on. So it's about, I think it's about 45 minutes in length. It's well worth watching. I wouldn't make you watch all of it, but if you want to watch all of it in this time of lockdown, please be my guest. I think it's well worth listening to. You could probably even have it on in the background whilst you're doing something else. You don't have to watch the facial expressions. You get a feel for what's going on once you've watched the first couple of minutes, and then you know who's talking when, because you know who their voices are. And that's fascinating. Anywho, I'm going to move on because I can't show it on here. I'd love to force you to watch it. Let's talk about representation. If you remember Burke, Edmund Burke, said that a representative had to act on their own initiative, which sounded like a dickish thing to say until you realised he was voting against slavery and was able to do so as a representative of Bristol, which, generally speaking, was full of slavers. So, according to Burke, MPs are not delegates. They may have a close relationship with their constituents. They may regularly work with their constituents, but they're not there to represent all of the constituency, their point of view in Parliament. That's not their job. Their job is to listen to what their constituents have to say and then decide whether or not that is valid enough to act in a particular way in Parliament. And sometimes they do. They bring local issues to central government, and sometimes they will do so at the detriment of their careers. So, for example, in June 2018, 8 Conservative MPs voted against the government on plans to expand Heathrow by another runway. Why? They represented constituencies that were directly affected. In so doing, they voted with various Labour MPs, even though they didn't want to, because the local issue was more important than the party issue under discussion. And that, in essence, is what we're talking about. If a politician is willing to risk their career for the sake of a local issue, then they are performing very adroitly their method of representation. You won't always see this. Sometimes it's impossible to tell the difference because they vote with the government wants to do what their locality wants to do. Historically, Churchill didn't check with his constituents when it came to the abdication of the king, and this led to problems. He was left alone. So politicians tend to get involved, and they tend to do what we call constituency duties in order to maintain this. So these are regular surgeries where people, members of the public, their constituents, come to chat with them. I guess most of them are online now. My local MP has been refusing to hold surgeries for a while since someone tried to smash the window of her office, and during coronavirus just didn't. She doesn't respond to emails either. I have tried. I got boilerplate responses. Tony Benn, remember him? Tony Benn said it was the most satisfying part of his job. After 50 years of being in Parliament, he said the most satisfying part of his job was going back to his constituents and talking to them and finding out what their concerns were and representing them in Parliament. And that, I think, sums it up. A lot of MPs, regardless of how cynical you are, a lot of MPs, nearly all MPs, I say nearly all because our Prime Minister, but nearly all MPs go into Parliament to represent the people they know, to represent their constituency, and they genuinely believe in that. They're not actually all that cynical. They genuinely want to do that, and that is fascinating. These are people who go into politics with the best of intentions. However, how much can you reasonably do this? Well, do you reflect the social makeup of the UK? And the answer is, of course, no. No, of course you don't. And you may argue, well, you don't need to. Do you need a gay person in Parliament to represent gay people? Or do people just with good morals represent gay people? Do you need a black woman in Parliament to represent all black women? Or can you just be black or a woman? Or can you be neither and still represent black women if they're in your constituency? Do you see what I mean? So, yeah, all right, Parliament is dominated by white middle-class males. And some people argue, that's fine. I'm not one of those people, by the way, just in case you don't notice that. And you could argue more convincingly, says the textbook, that the major problem of representation isn't social representation. The major problem of representation is political representation. Because bear in mind, we have a simple majority, single-member constituency system. And that means the winner might not have a majority of votes behind them. They don't represent a majority even of their constituents. Therefore, the political views of people that didn't vote for them are not represented by that person in Parliament. The MP does not represent all constituents, whether or not they are the same social makeup of where they represent. The next point that Parliament can provide is debate. And this is to debate the government programme. Now, no, debate doesn't mean throwing up arguments for the sake of throwing up arguments. It doesn't mean voting against something if you're not the government and voting for something if you are the government. It means to encourage public debate. It's to educate and to talk out what's going on. It's why we have a liberal system of education in this country. It is believed that the good will out and good ideas will win out over bad. If you allow people to argue bad ideas, people will realise those ideas are bad. They will hang themselves with the rope you give them. And so Parliament is all about debate. It's about talking things over and pointing out flaws. For example, the EU Withdrawal Bill. Private members' bills also allow for debate. Private members' bills are parts of parliamentary business that MPs, backbenchers generally, even opposition MPs, get to put forward laws they think would be a good idea. Now, generally speaking, these tend not to get passed, but they do provoke debate. For example, the upskirting bill that was put forward as a private member's bill and then talked out, filibustered, if you will, by Chris Chope in 2019. That was an interesting one. Chris Chope argued that it wasn't the role of private members' bills to be passed, and that debate was pointless because everyone understood upskirting was a bad thing, and they should instead petition the government to change it. I mean, it's not a great look for a man talking out an upskirting bill about sexual assault being a bloke, but there we go. That's private members' bills. They tend not to get passed, but they do provoke responses, and they do provoke controversy. There are also opposition days, when the business of the House of Commons is handed over to opposition parties who otherwise wouldn't get any say in what goes on at all. Now, again, these bills, these opposition days where they have debates on various things, might not lead to anything in particular, but they do raise the profile of something, and they can be reported on in the press. I do apologise, I'm licking my lips a lot. I don't know if that's coming across in the video. I feel like I'm about to prepare for some kind of major meal or something. I think it's just the way I'm talking. There are also emergency debates. Parliament can demand debates if enough people vote in favour and if they can impress upon the Speaker to make them happen. So, for example, when Theresa Human Rights are optional May, did his business with Syria in 2018, there was an emergency debate the following day in which she was essentially told off by various MPs for not coming to Parliament first. And this sort of tradition started toward the ends of Tony Blair's time as Prime Minister, when he became significantly more presidential. Nowadays, we're used to the idea of government announcing policy in major announcements to the press rather than in Parliament. Need I remind you of Monday at 8 p.m. And that was recorded. So these sorts of things require Parliament to flex its muscle and show what debate can really achieve. So sometimes debates are very important because they force the government to explain why they've done what they've done, which otherwise you wouldn't get. It'll be intriguing to see what happens with Gavin Williamson's announcement in Parliament, and that may have already taken place. I haven't been checking the news. How effective are debates? Well, frustratingly, at the end of a debate, if there is a vote held, people tend to be swayed more by the party whips than they are by the debate points that have been raised. They will vote along party lines. It was fascinating to watch rebels against the EU Withdrawal Bill from the Conservative Party benches say one thing in the debate and then vote with the government immediately afterwards. And that was interesting. And people point that out. And they also say that a lot of debates can't change the law anyway. So, for example, if 100,000 people sign an e-petition, it will be debated in Parliament. That means there'll be time set aside to discuss the issue that's on the e-petition. And they will have a debate about it, they'll discuss it, but there's no need for a vote at the end of that. It will change nothing. There'll just be a debate in Parliament. That's it. That's all it can do. And you might argue, well, what is the point of those debates? They can't change anything. What they can do is they can raise pressure, they can suggest ideas, they can form an impetus to form new legislation in the form of public or private members' bills. Providing government is the next area. Parliament, and the House of Commons in particular, has a fused executive and legislature. That is, it has two things in the same box, as it were. The legislature provides the executive. The cabinet ministers are appointed from MPs. And this can be a good thing. The convention is that the cabinet is taken directly from MPs. And that's good because it means you can appoint people who've shown themselves to be good at debate, who've shown themselves to be good parliamentarians. There's nothing saying they have to come from the ruling party. You can invite an opposition MP into your government if you wish as Prime Minister. And how else is a Prime Minister going to see about the political nous and the political chicanery of people except by watching them in Parliament? On that basis, this is a really good idea. You can learn on the job. You get to prove your abilities before you are appointed. In theory, the question mark's there because in theory. So, for example, you've got Churchill on appointing an MP to cabinet who was told by the chief whip he's too young to be eligible to cabinet, to which Churchill responded in pure Churchillian fashion, he's too eligible to be too young. In other words, they were too good at their job. Of course, they'd be invited into cabinet. How effective is this in reality? Well, as many as 1 in 3 of the ruling party politicians and the MPs may hold government positions. Ouch, that's 1/3 of a ruling party. That is an insanely large number. Can you really say that 1/3 of the party are talented in a particular area that way? Well, of course you can't. And also, prime ministers may appoint and may be forced to appoint people to cabinet for things other than talent. Big beasts, as it were, people you cannot afford to ignore. Famously in history, Macmillan, a Conservative Party Prime Minister, had to appoint people to his cabinet that he couldn't afford to have as opponents. And so he appointed the cabinet as an appeasement. I'll talk about that more when we talk about the powers of the executive and the powers of the Prime Minister. And then you look at this photograph of our current cabinet and you wonder, Gavin Williamson, there he is. Gavin Williamson as Education Secretary, having previously been sacked as Defence Secretary for being rubbish and leaking state secrets. Priti Patel, where's Priti Patel? There she is. Priti Patel appointed as Home Secretary, despite previously being convicted of actual treason. Liz Truss, remember the cheese? She's our trade envoy. And you wonder about why they've been appointed to the cabinet. And I'm going to leave it hanging on that appoint on things other than talent. Now, I'm well aware this video has gone on way too long for a double lesson, especially with the 2 YouTube links that I've shoved in there that I'm expecting you to watch some of at least to get a feel for things. I would have shown you more in a lesson, I'm sure, because things would have sparked in my mind and you'd have reminded me of things. So this is way too much information, I'm aware of it. So I'll stop the share at this point and we'll say, okay, we're done. We've done the functions of the House of Commons, which means the next time I do one of these lessons will be on the functions of the House of Lords, and we'll probably get all the way through that too. Tomorrow, my plan is to hold some kind of meeting, a Teams meeting, where we can discuss the essays you did before Christmas, and we can talk in more depth about any issues you have arising from those, and I can make general points to you about those. I've attached them to the previous task. You should have access to them by now. Thank you all very much if you have been for watching, and I shall see you tomorrow. Or if you're watching this after that lesson, I guess I'll see you on the next lesson. Anyway, doesn't matter. Have a lovely day, and I shall see you around.